Merhabalar arkadaşlar. I want to talk about 5 books that anybody who's studying psychology, whether you're a student, layperson, whatever, should absolutely read. Okay? The first one, right out of the gate, is the Holy Bible of... Where is this? Okay. The Holy Bible of Evolutionary Psychology. Every evolutionary psychology book I've ever read has referenced this book in some way or another. And for good reason. The book collapses the distinction between culture and biology. It talks about how culture is biologically rooted, and when you actually look at differences amongst culture, yes, there are some differences, but there are also a lot of cultural universals. For example, language, family structure, social status, these common tropes, similar hierarchies, these common tropes tend to show up universally in different cultures. There's also stuff about the misuses of Darwinism inside social sciences. That's a very important topic. There's just so much in here. There's also one study about adaptations for memory and how women have better memory for like the locations of things in front of them, but men have better memory for like landmarks and stuff like that. A lot of good arguments in here, a lot of interesting research in here, and I think it's a very healthy way of conceptualizing the culture and biology take. It's not arguing that culture is useless, it's arguing that the nature-nurture thing is actually like it's almost a false distinction, and we should just focus on what physical structures are in the brain and what cognitive functions they serve for navigating the environment and how those structures evolved, right? So super important book. Okay, so social, why our brains are wired to connect. I think this is important for most psychologists, especially humanist psychologists, who don't know how to argue for like a naturalistic view of their ideas. When you ask psychologists about like, oh, why do people experience social pain or yada yada yada, if they don't study neuroscience, they tend to make really bad arguments that they think are just self-evident. They're like, well, it's human nature to like experience pain, or like it's just the case. They kind of appeal to like self-evidency. But if you actually study the neuroscience of these we'll call human qualms or like human issues, mental health problems, you can actually root your arguments back into neuroscience. And this is just one example of doing that, where things like rejection, depression caused by breaking up with someone, yada yada yada, that kind of stuff, can actually be rooted in neuroscience, because what Lieberman found was that when people experience things like social rejection, opioids are actually released into areas of the brain responsible for social cognition. And as we know, opioids are pain suppressors, right? So again, you can actually root your arguments in biology and make it more concrete, more convincing. And yeah, I think that's super important. This book is a terrific book for understanding the classic experiments in social psychology. It goes over all the classic experiments in social psychology. Like literally, if not all of them, a lot of them. Just to give an example, here's a really good one. If we put 6 people into a room and we ask them which line is the longest, except, let's say you're one of these 6 people and you're the 6th person to go, so the last person to go. Now here's the catcher, is we tell the 5 people before you to say that line A is the longest, okay? But clearly this line is the shortest. But because those 5 people said line A was the longest, you're more likely to agree that line A is the longest, despite the fact that we all can very clearly see that it's line B, right? Line B is the longest. So here's just one example, one classical experiment of how people will conform. Invisible influence is a very good way of saying it. And he applies it to the real-world examples as well. So, good book to read. This book, I think, is a must-read. So a lot of people in psychology learn about abnormal psychology, and schizophrenia would fall under abnormal psychology. But this account of schizophrenia is a very, very original, wonderful take, okay? So he accepts the theory that the frontal lobes are like the executive control center of the brain. He then goes to show that, because in schizophrenia it's a degenerative disease where the brain kind of just deteriorates over time, he goes to show that deteriorations in the frontal lobes can explain symptoms like, for example, schizophrenics will report to hear voices, I should say patients, but they report to hear voices, and they experience those voices as being other than their own. But we know that we all have internal voices, and so what he's arguing is not that they actually hear a voice, but that they lose that sense of control or agency over that voice, okay? Because the frontal lobe is deteriorated. Another one might be is, a common symptom is that someone else is controlling their body or their behaviors. Again, losing capacity in the frontal lobe because it's deteriorating could explain that you don't feel in control of your behaviors. There's just tons and tons of symptoms that can be explained by a loss of sense of control. And for that reason, there are some critiques of this book, or this, I guess, essay, whatever you want to call it. But for that reason, it's super original, and I think you should read it. The last book is Daniel Dennett. He is a controversial figure, not only in philosophy, but psychology, cognitive science, whatever you want to say. The reason why I think psychology students should read this is because he kind of argues for a pragmatic use of folk psychology language. Now, what folk psychology language is basically, there's a distinction that's made amongst philosophers about words referring to things in the world and words referring to properties of consciousness. So, for example, my appeal to my own feeling of happiness is appealing to a property of consciousness. My looking at the color red, saying that's red, or that this table's brown, is an appeal to the property of subjective experience. But if I were to want to make a more scientific account of the color brown, then maybe I would look at the physiology of the eye, or look at the color processing components in the brain. That would be a more, there's a reference to something in the world type of just account. And that kind of language, they argue, is more scientific, because you can verify the terms up against reality. But Dennett thinks that when you actually look at psychology, for example, there's a lot of problems, namely that most of the language is folk psychology. It is saying, the reason why you feel sad, right? Not referring to someone's brain and saying the reason why you're missing serotonin. We don't talk like that in psychology. So Dennett thinks that there's a pragmatic use for some of these folk psychology dialogues, even though they're not scientific, because it's just more useful and we better understand it. And the point of maybe therapy isn't necessarily to be super rigorous in science, but maybe to help people understand their traumas. And so for that reason, Dennett actually argues that we should use the folk psychology language. So psychology students who don't understand that distinction can get a lot of utility from reading Dennett on this particular issue. So those are some of the books that I think every psychology student or someone who just wants to learn psychology should be reading. That being said, choose.